All right, we're on to the next panel. The next panel is Racing to Zero. As you can imagine from the speakers that you've heard before, we still need to be thinking about building tomorrow's technology. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Gerry Anderson. He's Executive Chair of DTE. He's EEI Chair for approximately 15 more hours. Gerry, come on up. On the panel, we have Ben Fowke, who served as EEI's chairman last year, who just retired as executive chair of Xcel Energy. He also sits on the board of AEP. Neva Espinoza, she's vice president of energy supply and low carbon resources at EPRI. And we also have Hans Kobler, who is founding and managing partner of Energy Impact Partners. Come on up.
Thank you, sir. Good. Good to see you. How you doing? Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you being here at the Hub. And thank you, Brian, wherever you went for those introductions. Appreciate that. So we are pleased to be here this afternoon to talk about clean energy innovation. And I'll start by saying that I am proud of the progress this industry has made on carbon reductions. And I think most of you have been watching it, but we have made a lot of progress over the last decade, depending on the year you're counting, down 35 to 40% versus 2005. And if you look at other sectors, they haven't moved or have drifted up. So we really are the only sector that has this carbon emission reduction in process. All that said, there's a lot more to do. We know that. We all have targets out there of zero or net zero. And so we're going to need new policies and new technologies, new ways of thinking in order to achieve those long-term goals and commitments. And Warner, Brian, Jigger, and Rob in the previous panel walked through policy drivers for clean energy innovation. And before them, if you were here, you heard from Dr. Weber, and he helped us to understand the scope and scale of what we face, as well as the opportunities that technology and technology transition can offer. He finished on a hopeful note, and that's where we'd like to pick up. We're going to talk about the tools and the technologies that are going to help electric companies like Ben's, like mine, achieve the zero or net zero goals that have been put out. And to that end, nearly all of EEI's member companies have one of those long-term commitments. And I can tell you, as a company that has one, they drive your boardroom discussion once you've made them. Because everything begins to revolve around your ability to meet the commitment you've put out there. So we have 38 member companies that have put out zero or net zero commitments, and that is the vast majority of the carbon emissions in our sector, because all of the big companies have made those commitments. In the near term, we know that deploying more wind, solar paired up with batteries is going to take us a long way down the road. I think the next decade will be dominated by that activity, but we also know that we need to keep our nuclear fleets operating or we'll go backwards. And long term, it's become very clear that we're going to need additional technologies. There was talk 5 years ago about wind, solar, and battery finishing the trip. There's not much talk about that anymore. We know we're going to need clean 24/7 generating technologies that work and work reliably in order to meet the reduction goals that we put out there, and at the same time keep our product reliable and secure and affordable. That is the conclusion we came to at DTE Energy after a lot of intensive modeling of what's a very cold northern climate. Ben comes from one of those too. He and I have had a lot of conversations. You need these new technologies to make the trip. So the question is, how are we going to move these technologies from research and development to serious demonstration and deployment and actually get some of them commercial in a time frame that will meet the needs of companies trying to make those commitments real. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I actually think I'm going to start with you, Ben.
Okay.
Because you were, I think, the first company in the sector to put out a goal of 80% reduction by 2030. So that's a long way down in a short time. And I know you've also got a zero goal out there, I think 2050.
Right.
And when you were doing your analysis to try to get your head around whether those could actually be achieved, what did you discover about some of the technologies that I was just talking about?
Yeah, well, thanks, Gerry. This was all happening in 2018, but, we were already on the clean energy journey. I think by that time, we'd probably already reduced our carbon by 50%. We had been a leader in wind deployment on our system, and I think for 10 years in a row, we were the #1 wind provider. So we were definitely into the clean energy transition, but you mentioned modeling in your opening, and I have a great team, and they started to model the breakthroughs that we continue to see in the renewable technology, along with some changes in the tax regulations. Mm-hmm. And it became pretty apparent, particularly in our region of the country, which is very rich in wind resources, that with large-scale wind, that could actually be the least cost energy on our system. And you combine that then with what was then low natural gas prices. Things have changed a little bit in the last year, but it made it clear that we could also accelerate the movement away from coal. And you put all that together, and if we could convince our regulators that we needed to preserve our existing carbon-free nuclear fleet, we could hit that 80% carbon reduction goal by 2030, keep our product affordable and reliable. In fact, we kind of coined a phrase, steel for fuel, which basically means that the steel is primarily the windmills, but when the wind's blowing, it's displacing variable fossil fuel, and when you model the cost of the wind versus the variable energy of our fossil plants, it was saving customers money. So everybody liked that. The environment was the beneficiary. Our customers, it helped reduce their bills, and importantly, the steel is something we can invest in as a utility, and I think that's pretty important to the proposition. I mean, you mentioned we're leading this clean energy transition as an industry, so I think it was really important that our investors benefited from it as well, and they did. So that's how we got to the 80%. We knew how to get there. It's not easy. You need regulatory approval, but the carbon-free goal by 2050 was also important to us too, because if you're going to have a shade tree, you got to plant the seed at some point. And we knew, and you mentioned it, Gerry, that those technologies to get that last 20% off the grid need to be developed. And the sooner we get started on it, the sooner we can deploy them. It also, quite honestly, was a platform to talk about the importance of nuclear and the need for some natural gas as we move away from coal to keep our system reliable. And the physics of the grid, if you will, that suggests the big grid that we're all connected to. You just can't do that on renewable energy alone. Yeah. And without sacrificing reliability and affordability. And that, of course, nobody wants to see that happen. So that was the reason why we launched that. And you made the point earlier, the industry, now everybody has about the same goals.
Well, in order to further what you were learning when you were chair at EEI, you preceded me in that role, and you stood up what we called CFTI.
I heard you're doing a lot better job.
That's very debatable. But you stood up the CFTI, the Carbon Free Technology Initiative, I think because of what you were learning. But maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about what that was and what you hoped would come out of it.
Again, it was a recognition that if we were going to get beyond that 80% of carbon reduction, we were going to need different technologies. And these technologies can take a long time to develop. They don't happen overnight. And so if we wanted to achieve our goal by 2050, and other people have similar goals, you had to get started today. And whether it was, we tried to be technology agnostic, but it needed to really focus on just something that was dispatchable. I think I heard a prior speaker say we're awash in energy, but capacity that you can plan for is at a paramount. And whether that's carbon capture, whether that's hydrogen, whether that's long-term battery storage, whether that's nuclear energy, we really need to start developing those technologies today so they'd be available for tomorrow.
Well, I can remember back in 2019 or so, spending time on Capitol Hill and just being depressed by the level of understanding of what it would take to make the grid run. And there was a lot of talk about 100% renewable grid in 10 years, and no understanding of what Ben was just talking about, that energy and capacity are very different things. It's radically different now. It's just sort of commonplace for people to understand more, at least talking level about what we're discussing here. And I think a significant amount of that has to do with the fact that we stood up this initiative and began to go to them and talk to them over and over and over that if we're going to make this trip, it's going to require new technologies. We will not finish the trip, period. And then other analysts began to hit the same point. And at a similar time, Neva, EPRI started to work on its low carbon technology initiative. And I will say, by the way, that if you don't know Neva, she's one of the people here at this gathering that actually knows an awful lot about these technologies, their current state, their economics, maturity, and so forth. So you can pigeonhole her at some point, and she'll tell you a lot. But Neva, you were standing up this low carbon technology initiative, and you ended up partnering with the national labs in that effort. So maybe you could describe that for folks and what you're learning and finding.
Absolutely, great, thank you, Gerry. So the Low Carbon Resources Initiative, which Gerry is referencing, is one of the largest collaboratives that's really focused on demonstrating and deploying some of these longer-term low-carbon technologies. We tend to focus mostly on hydrogen, ammonia, synthetic fuels, and biofuels, and we're really looking at how can we achieve that last, some people like to call it the last carbon mile, but that last piece of decarbonization that right now technologies are not able to fully support. Whether that be at cost or at scale, we are not ready to fully achieve net zero without new options being on the table in order to deploy that. So the Low Carbon Resources Initiative, and many of you are part of it, so we very much thank those of you who are. If you're not, please join us. But we have 54 different companies today that are focused on and supporting this initiative. So you can, I'm sure you all have your Google searches set up and you're reading different articles every single day about exciting projects that are going on. Every single project that's out there is going to make a difference. Part of what the LCRI is doing is pulling all those learnings into one spot. In order to achieve these goals, which we've already discussed are super aggressive, if we are not learning from each other in every single project we're doing and leapfrogging step by step, achieving net zero by 2050 is going to be significantly harder. So some of the exciting, we have projects kind of across the entire R&D spectrum today, but it's not just early stage technology. There are things in the ground that we are actually demonstrating right now as we speak. We've already demonstrated blending hydrogen in existing gas turbines with minimal to no retrofit needed. We've done that both in New York State, we've done that with Southern Company and others. So really a lot of exciting things. Hydrogen blending in pipelines today, a huge part of what we're focused on and working on and really starting to push that technology forward. Now, it doesn't just take industry collaboration, but it takes huge stakeholder collaboration. So we've partnered with GTI Energy, who has traditionally focused on the gas system. So a lot of work going on with GTI Energy as well as national labs and others. So we're really excited about it. We're seeing a lot of exciting projects starting to move forward and implementations in the ground.
It's interesting to talk to Neva about the economics and stage of development of these technologies because the costs today currently don't hunt, right? They're high. But I can remember back in the 2000-ish time frame, or even 2008-9, when you looked at solar, you said that just doesn't hunt. And of course, wind and solar hunt really, really well today. So we've got to, through the sorts of initiatives that Ben kicked off at EEI, to try to bring industry and congressional focus to this issue. We got to take them through technology development now, which EPRI is focused on and working with the gas industry and with the national labs. But there are obviously other ways that the market can bring innovation outside of our industry, or at least parallel to our industry. And Hans, you are in the middle of that. And the private sector can bring tremendous innovation, energy, financial energy, technical acumen, and so forth to the table, which is really what Energy Impact Partners is about. So maybe you could tell folks a bit about that organization, your organization, and what you're into, and most, in some ways, most excited about, and what motivates your interest or drive in particular technologies that you're pursuing.
Thanks, Gerry. Well, I'd like to think of us working with the industry.
Yep.
So we are, just for those of you that don't know us, we're a venture capital firm. We are specialized on the energy transition. Our edge comes from working with utility partners. Ben was kind enough to give us money, 7, 8 years ago, one of the first ones.
So you were kind enough to give us a return.
I like that where that is going. So we work with industry, mostly core utilities, but over the years, built environment have joined us. We have technology players in industry investors that realize that they want to work with you all. And we work together looking for what we think are the key building blocks of the energy transition. We are a venture capital firm, so we invest in companies, not in projects. And we work with our partners to try to find who those best performing companies will be, the key technologies you need, and the ones that make us money. And the beauty is that we learned over the last 8 years that if we really align with industry, finding those technologies that you can scale, then it's more likely we make money. So for us to guide, we do surveys. We actually had one fresh off the press. Our annual meeting is next week. Some of you may come there. So fresh off the press, I like numbers more than words. So we scale everything on a scale of 5, and the winner this year is storage. For the first time, I think it's a reflection of the intermittency that we're all dealing with. Cybersecurity, our portfolio company Dragos is there, just made it back up there with the Russians invading, and we have a new entrance with carbon capture management. So those are the kind of the key themes that we then form working groups with our partners, where they put the experts together with our research team, and then we methodically try to find those nuggets and then help scale them. So we've done that now for quite some time. But we think bringing this capital and the industry together is just another way to accelerate the growth of those brilliant technologies that you are all seeding and identifying.
You said the two themes were storage, and what was the second?
Well, we got 22, but the number one this year was storage, followed by anything dealing with intermittency. The resilience is a big topic, and Chanty Rock is over there. Cyber made it back. Cyber was falling back, but following the Ukraine attack, where you all know what that means for us. So that made it back up again. And carbon capture, management, storage, first time in the top 10 this year.
This year?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Not surprising that cyber made the jump in the wake of the Ukraine situation. And people ask you what keeps you awake at night. I'm going to be leaving the industry, so I guess this won't keep me awake at night in the future. But if I wanted to be kept awake, it would be thinking about the fact that we're going to hang transportation increasingly off the electric grid, and eventually a lot of building heating off of the electric grid. And when you begin to think about, and we're going to electrify a lot of core industry as well, and you think about the vulnerability to everyday lives of citizens and the core of industry from any disruption of the electric grid at large scale, it's immense. And so there's nothing to be trifled with over time. We've got to get that exactly right. And energy security is another topic that I don't know if we'll get into it here, but as we transition to renewables, they have their own security issues. Critical minerals getting a lot of attention for their security of supply and where they're sourced from, who processes them. A lot of them in China today, so forth. So very interesting, Hans. Well, you know, the last panel talked about the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and the fact that it had provided substantial funding for some of these technologies. So funding is critical. It's really important to have money to push development, but it isn't the only thing. And I guess I'd like to spend a little time now on beyond capital. What other elements of an ecosystem need to be put together for these technologies to move, say, over the next 10 years to something that's real? And that one I'll pose to all three of you, and whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
Go ahead.
Sure, I'll go first. So I think when you look at the pathways to 2050 and the different ways we're going to get there, the one thing that continuously stands out to me is scale. And the scale of what that's going to take. So if you look at electricity's role in the energy economy today, electricity is about 21% of final energy today. By 2050, we expect electricity someplace between 40 to 60% of final energy at the end of the day. So when you think about, well, what is that going to take? Well, in terms of scale, it's going to take a huge amount of capacity build out, somewhere, depending on the pathway we end up on, between 2 and 5 times the amount of capacity on the electric system as compared to today, which is a whole lot. That's going to create a whole bunch of transmission distribution build out and capability or needs. And those two things lead to having a really robust, well-planned supply chain to achieve that. And when we think about a net zero economy, a lot of times we're talking about the supply chain being part of that. But Gerry, to your point, a lot of we all live and breathe a global supply chain. So really understanding for the different build out of technologies that we have, what does that whole chain look like, and are we really planning that chain to be quite as large and quite as robust as we're going to need it to? I just think is a really important part of that conversation.
Ben?
Exponential increase in devices coming from distributed energy resources. Said it very well. I maybe just even the labor side of that. You think about supply chain. I mean, you know,
the communication infrastructure is really so.
There was a time where I think we thought our nuclear industry was going to go away. Think about all the talent that goes away with that, and the national defense ramifications of that. So, I really think that supply chain is something we really have to think about. I think we learned through COVID just how dependent we are on the global supply chain, and you know, sometimes it's a minor inconvenience, but sometimes it has tremendous implications not only for our industry, but for I think our national defense as well. So I think it's a real eye-opener, and I think we've got to pull that together and make sure we can actually execute on the plan.
Yep. Hans?
Well, I'm going on this, what you just said, on the last mile or the last 10, 20%, the technologies to get us to 40, 60%. I mean, we are 20%. Our Norwegian, we have partners in Norway, they're at 50% today. Now they have the benefit of a big, the country is a battery basically, all the hydro dams, but it can be electrified. But there's so much innovation happening to transform steel, cement, fertilizer manufacturing, heating, that is now happening. We track those venture-funded companies every year, and 3 years ago there were 7,376 companies that worldwide got $1 million investments in our sector. Last year it were 14,355. So there's so much innovation happening that we think will bring us to a level that we have not been thinking about. Don't want to argue with our CTO that says everything is 200 years old that we are doing here, but there are exciting things happening out there that, you know, from nuclear fusion that might happen to, and so I think the future may look very different 10 years from now than we think it is today.
Well, if I could jump on that point for a second, because I think that economy-wide approach and view is becoming more and more important, right? We can't just be looking at sector-specific solutions. We need to be looking at that sector coupling from now. So you say storage is number one. Well, when you think about energy storage, the way we store energy today is very, very different than how we may store energy tomorrow. Matter of fact, most of our energy storage today is in natural gas, right? So when you think about a world where we may or may not be heavily reliant on natural gas, gaseous fuels will still be an important role. Lower carbon gaseous fuels, right? So we have to really understand how the electric sector couples to those parts of the economy and how we can create those partnerships from the beginning to drive solutions. And that's one of the things you see exciting in the bipartisan infrastructure laws, these hub concepts. You're seeing them for hydrogen, you see them for direct air capture, but it's really driving that sector coupling from the beginning to create market solutions for the future.
Well, you make a great point that as you begin to broaden your thinking beyond the electric sector and take other sectors in and realize that electrifying them is going to play an important role, the scale of what we're trying to do blows way up, and the constraints begin to become more apparent. So we have difficulties citing transmission today. It takes forever. But if we really want to move at pace and scale on what Neva was just talking about, that constraint is really going to bind. Renewable siting is getting difficult. Now in Michigan, it's hard to cite renewable wind anymore, period. And in a lot of places, solar's beginning to hit that sort of resistance. That has to be dealt with. We said we're going to go a long way down the road with wind and solar. You have got to have people willing to cite it in order for that to be true. But I will tell you this, if you try to drive down the road of large-scale hydrogen production through renewables and map out how much renewables that takes, it's a very well-respected environmental organization who's done a lot of quantitative analysis that said we're going to hit siting constraints down that path, which to them means we got to have these technologies that are being talked about here. And so I think there are things we don't yet see because we haven't hit the constraints. The last one I'll mention is a lot of people today saying, how on earth did Europe get themselves in such a dependent situation with Russian gas? Well, if you look hard at the critical mineral supply to renewable technologies, batteries, solar, et cetera, and look where they come from, and how much of them are processed through countries that aren't our allies, we better watch it, or we're going to be saying to ourselves, how on earth did we let ourselves get in this situation, unless we figure that out. So we got the warning, but we better not go to sleep on the warning, or we will be exactly where we were with oil, and exactly where Europe is with natural gas. So that is something this industry has to keep pressing on.
That's kind of the same thing around cyber. Right?
Well, regulatory policy is another important piece of this ecosystem. So any thoughts on changes to regulations that we need beyond what we've talked about here?
Well, I guess I can start that off. I mean, a few things come to mind. I mean, generally, I think the regulators can't let perfection be the enemy of the great. You know, when I announced an 80%, Xcel rather announced an 80% carbon reduction plan, we said we had to keep our existing nuclear fleet. We also said we're going to need some natural gas, and you know that didn't go over real well. But that's the practical reality. You know, you got to keep moving forward as you're developing those technologies that'll get that last 20% out. And I think the regulator has a difficult time doing that. And so you don't get the gas pipelines built, you don't get that transmission infrastructure built to do all this stuff, and then you're stuck. Because the last thing we want to do is have a reliability issue. And you know, I think there's talk about that more probability of that than it has been many years. So I think that has to be recognized, and I think the utilities that are moving forward with that have to be encouraged for their good efforts. And you know, That's, of course,
Yeah.
a retired CEO who's, from a utility industry is always
Yeah,
going to
that's
say
what
that,
I'm
but it's
thinking,
absolutely
closing
paramount for
really
capital
what I would say
formation.
is, I think,
And then I think on some of these new
how do you
technologies, and
collaborate with
nuclear energy is a
industries?
great
This,
example of that,
this is
we
yet another
cannot regulate
opportunity
these technologies
to
like
work
we
together,
regulated,
leverage the
the
expertise
legacy
we have across
nuclear
our
technologies,
companies
and I'm sure other
and,
technologies fall into that
really innovate at scale
category too, but
and
it's,
have
it-
a common and
the
logical
new
voice in
technology
whatever
is
we
completely
on
different than
product
the old
roadmaps,
technology, so we have to
you
break
know,
through those
on
regulatory
applications,
paradigms so that we can make these things possible and importantly economical.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
I
last
think
panel
that's
was
your
saying,
closing. You can do
not
it
a
in your
safety
closing.
mandate alone,
Well, I'll
but
talk
there
when I
needs to
finish
be a
kinda giving
climate
cybersecurity. You could just
mandate that
piggyback
begins to
on
press
that and
on
talk about the
timing.
security
And
alliance,
safety
right?
mandate alone can take decades.
I'd
Hans?
second your
No, I
opening.
think-
It's,
I
you know,
think
we need wind and solar,
What-
and we need
when you're
transmission
closing,
lines.
you're touching the security
It almost
connectors.
seems easier
Oh,
to
yeah, that's
lay a wire
You
from
can add
Australia
this
to
after I
Singapore, or
can-
from Morocco to Berlin, than from
security
Oklahoma to
connector.
New York,
can
and
ask
that
you
cannot
for
be the answer.
closing
Bigger
costs.
markets are much more efficient and effective.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a
And
key,
then it's
a
utility
key part of the
security
equation
advisory
Yeah.
board.
to really
Right.
scale the
So-
decarbonization. And the regulators have to help. They did in pipelines, so it must be possible.
I think I would just add that while we're driving towards a net zero future and we're continuously looking at the future, we shouldn't ignore where we've been in the past. And when I say that, where we are in terms of greenhouse gases and CO2 is all relative. And what's low carbon today is not going to be the same thing that's low carbon in 2050. And I think we need to acknowledge that and make
Yeah,
sure we're
yeah,
setting
it's
up a
getting
system that
already
lets us take
busy.
those steps
as the
in
older
a
cities wrap up
responsible,
college,
resilient,
graduation,
reliable
stuff.
way so we can let technology continue to build and
thought you and
continue
I
to
talked, so
grow
he's
and be
headed
ready
to
for the next step into it. So that gets me to all technologies, which I always will, I'm sure, end
Yes,
on.
he's super.
All technologies are going to be really
Well,
sweet.
we are going to end
Yeah,
on
he-
all
you know,
technologies, but with a question around,
Is that right? Yeah.
look, you're all looking at a lot of technologies. Which are you most optimistic about? And if you want to tell us one that's getting a lot of attention that you're worried about, you could do that too. But at minimum, what are you excited about?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
All right, so I'm excited about companies that make us money. So that's a very that's a very different approach. There are a lot of great technologies out there that are ready to scale. Enchanted Rock for resilience, or Dragos, etc. For cyber. We like the ones that deal with the hard part, the intermittency in between, the storage, smarts, transmission, making your operations better. That's one area that we think is critical. We launched a new fund called the Frontier Deep Decarbonization Fund that deals with those really challenging problems. So those are much shinier objects, but they're further out. The hydrogen would be a great solution, but it has a long way to go on cost. As you pointed out, we've been wrong before, so maybe they make it there. And then carbon capture would be right up on our list, but we haven't found the perfect solution yet on air. The carbon point, we found one. But so those are kind of the things we look at and that get us excited.
Great. Neva?
So at EPRI, I'm excited about all technologies because that is what I'm paid to be excited for. But in all reality, we are excited about a lot of technologies, and I don't want to just point on one because at the end of the day, all technologies need to be on the table. So many of you have probably heard me say in the past, optionality is not an option. It is a requirement. When we look at the regional differences, of course, globally, but even here in the United States, we need to be able to focus on a region's natural resources and a region's economy locally to come up with the best optimized solution for that local community. And the more technologies that are on the table are going to enable more resiliency, more reliability, and more affordability for our overall energy system.
I agree with all of the above too, but I'll give a specific technology, and I just think, we cannot afford, first of all, to lose our existing nuclear fleet. I think it's 20% of the nation's energy mix and about 55% of the carbon-free mix. So you see plants go out because they're in organized markets that don't recognize the carbon-free value and the capacity value, and I think that's really a shame. At the same time, this new generation, the technology exists. We can do it. We have to have the political will to do it. And, we talked a lot about how much scale, I think you said it, Neva, how much renewables it would take to, replace the gas system for the LDC heating load. I think it's 3 times, just there. More so if you do hydrogen. So the nuclear is very dense, and the land mass is pretty minimal. So I absolutely think we have to get serious about it. I really do.
I'm with Ben on nuclear is ultimately going to be part of the mix, because when you look at the siting constraints for renewables, nobody will talk about that today, but people will talk about it when they start to bind. And we can't cite renewables to continue to drive this. We're going to need some dense solutions, and nuclear is one of those. The other thing that I'm very focused on, and it's because I live in Michigan, and Michigan happens to be one of the places in the country that has perfect geology for gas storage. So we have hundreds of, 600 million cubic feet, almost 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas stored, and there are 4.5 trillion cubic feet stored nationwide of natural gas. If you want to look at the big battery for this country, it's natural gas is our big battery. And it comes roaring out on those cold heating days in the winter. And it doesn't get denominated in hours, it gets denominated in months. So you contract for months of supply, not hours of supply. That's not easy to recreate. And until we have solutions that can recreate that, we don't have a reliable way to pull heating into the electric load. And I think it's going to take things like Ben was mentioning. We're going to need some of those really dense sources of power to be able to produce some of the storage media that will solve that problem. We are out of time, so I just want to say thanks to the 3 of you for some great insights, and thanks to all of you for listening. Appreciate it.